Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first ever Black Nonbelievers family discussion about Christianity, white supremacy, and true liberation. I'm Mandisa Thomas, founder and president of Black Nonbelievers, and your moderator for today's event. Black Nonbelievers is a 501c3 nonprofit organization headquartered in the Atlanta area. We connect with other Blacks and allies who are living free of religion and might otherwise be shunned by family and friends in a caring, friendly, and informative environment. Instead of accepting dogma, we determine truth and morality through reason and evidence. The mission of Black Nonbelievers is to provide secular fellowship, nurture and support nonbelievers in coming out, i.e., open identification, promote pride in the atheist, non-religious, secular identities, and organize members for various events and charitable causes. Black Nonbelievers welcomes all, regardless of age, gender identity, sexual identity, national origin, and racial identity. This event today is co-sponsored by the Stiefel Free Thought Foundation. Please visit our website at Black Nonbelievers to support our work and for more information. This discussion today is one that is necessary for us to have as a family, as a Black community, which has always comprised those of us who are non-religious. One major concern to many of us is how much the Black community still holds on tightly to Christianity. While the general non-religious demographic is on the rise in the United States, the numbers in our communities are significantly lower in comparison. And as anti-racism work and progression becomes a focal point, it is apparent that something as foundational as faith could predispose us to more oppression and for longer periods of time. It is time for us to have this conversation. There is a saying that goes, "You cannot heal yourself in the same environment that made you sick." And while we acknowledge the roles that the church has played in the support for many in the Black community, the doctrine, with passages such as slaves obey your masters, the language of submission, and the constant appeal to divine intervention among many Black Christians has rendered this a crippling agent for our community, while at the same time being weaponized against us. And as our communities call for the end to racism, white supremacy, and institutions in which they have thrived, we must also include a critical examination of Christianity, given its history, and ask the tough questions about the paradox of faith and liberation. Today's discussion will take place in two segments. The first will focus on history and structural factors, and the second will focus on present day and looking to the future. We will take a few questions from the viewing audience, and then take a short break at the top of the hour. Be sure to stay online on YouTube and Facebook, or both, for the entire event. I am pleased to introduce our esteemed guests for the first segment of this discussion. First, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Anthea Butler, Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. A historian of African American and American religion, Dr. Butler's research and writing spans African American religion and history, race, politics, evangelicalism, gender and sexuality, media, and popular culture. Her current projects include 2 books for UNC Press: White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, which is due out in spring of 2021, and Reading Race: How Publishing Created a Lifeline for Black Baptists in Post-Reconstruction America. Our next panelist is Jeremiah Camara, author of Holy Lockdown, Does the Black Church Limit Progress? And The New Doubting Thomas, The Bible, Black Folks, and Blind Belief. He is also the producer of the documentaries Contradiction, A Question of Faith, and the newly released Holy Hierarchy, The Religious Roots of Racism in America. Both are available on Amazon Prime. Jeremiah is also the creator of the popular YouTube series Slave Sermons. Next up, we have Dr. Sikivu Hutchinson, founder and executive director of Black Skeptics Los Angeles and the Women's Leadership Project, a Black feminist mentoring and civic engagement program for girls of color in the South Los Angeles high school area. She is the author of several books, including the newly released Humanists in the Hood, Unapologetically Black, Feminist, and Heretical, and the play Narcolepsy, Inc., which premiered at the 2018 Hollywood Fringe Festival. Dr. Hutchinson is one of the 5 fierce humanists on the cover and cover story of the July-August 2018 issue of the Humanist magazine, and is also one of the co-producers of the Women of Color Beyond Belief conference. And last but not least, we have Dr. Alfonso Seville IV, the current Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow for the American Religion and Slavery in the Department of Theology at Georgetown University. A scholar of American religious history, his teachings and research include African American religious history, civic religion in America, and leadership development for faith and community leaders. Dr. Seville is also a guest contributor for the blog Race, Religion, and Rhetoric, and his upcoming book, The Gospel of John Merritt, is the first full-length study of North America's first Black ordained minister. So we're going to get into the questions here. We're going to get into the discussion. It's going to be a lot to cover in this short period of time. And thank you once again for joining me today. It is an honor to have you all. I'm going to ask 3 questions here, and I'm going to ask each panelist to keep their responses to about 2 to 3 minutes so that we can stay on schedule and allow for everyone to speak. So the first question is, considering recent events, there has been acknowledgement of Christianity, and there has been acknowledgement of Christianity as being a major source in establishing white supremacy and racist structures. What do you think is missing from this discussion? Dr. Butler, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate you all today. I think what's missing from this conversation about Christianity and being a part of establishing white supremacy and racist structures is actually 2 things. One is a real sense of the history behind what Christians did in terms of slavery and freedom. And the second part is how the racist parts of white Christianity, and I'm being very specific here, have been enshrined in structures about education, politics, etc. Let me just briefly explain, and I'm going to use kind of a little narrative to kind of go through with my upcoming book. One of the things that I think I have a tough time, or students actually have a tough time when I start to teach about this, is that Christianity is not just about the white savior. Christianity is actually has been used as a system of oppression. Whether you told slaves or not they should be obedient to their masters, or that Black people were enslaved because of the curse of Ham, or that, as we saw recently with a pastor in Atlanta who said that slavery was a blessing to white people. And yeah, it was, because basically they had people working for them for free, and that's how they gained all the wealth in this country. This is a way in which people begin to see how Christianity has been embedded in things. If we bring that up to the 20th century, we could start to talk about people like Billy Graham and others who actually were very much proponents of Jim Crow and used that as a structure to keep white men in power. If we go forward a little bit more, we start to think about things like, let's take something very simple, for example, that people may not think about now. If you are in your neighborhood and you look at charter schools, this whole idea of school vouchers is in part about not wanting to go to school with African Americans and other children of color. So this whole voucher movement was made as a way to keep white Christian schools intact and have them with predominantly white members. So I think one of the things, if we can see the long view, that would help to help us understand what is at stake here. So for the Christians today, especially African American Christians, who say, well, Jesus is the answer, you need to be saved, you need to do all this stuff. What they are missing from this discussion is how Christianity has been, number one, oppressive, two, part of the very structures that the Black church set itself against in trying to fight about in civil rights. It also blinds us to a history of people like Bayard Rustin and others who were not thinking about Christianity whatsoever, and were still fighting for the humanist right to be part of American culture. And I think if we start to put these things together in a way that's understandable for people, and also a way in which we can start to see where these systems of oppression have been used, especially using Jesus as a way to get people to stay quiet, and I'll say more about that later, I think we can start to see where religion has really hurt the African American community. And I'm not saying that people need to forget their faith. What I am saying is that you need to understand that that faith that you might believe in is a faith that has also been used to squelch your voice and to oppress you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Butler, for that. We're going to move on now to Jeremiah.
Thanks for having me, Mandisa. Always good. You're always doing what you're supposed to do. I appreciate that. That question, Mandisa, falls right in line with my film, Holy Hierarchy, The Religious Roots of Racism in America, which attempts to explain how beliefs in a supreme being led to beliefs in supreme human beings. And they got this mainly from iconography. Also the laws, like I say, you really don't understand America to the fullest until we understand the state of Virginia. All these laws that were passed in Virginia as it relates to Christianity and supremacy and these things like that. But I think what's missing is the how we don't pay attention to the iconography. The image always speaks louder than the words. I, as a Black person, should not be subjected to going into Walmart, to Walgreens, to CVS, and seeing white iconography. I was just in the dollar store about 2 weeks ago, and I saw Mother Mary, picture of white, Mother of Jesus, billboards, everywhere you go, doctor's offices. Mandisa, you did the cruise a couple of years ago, and you saw what the Miami airport looked like, just icons, white icons all over the place. Now, if Jesus is white and you believe that, then white supremacy is justified then. Because if the Son of God is white, then whites have an argument. Now, I'm not suggesting that we take this Jesus and change him to Black, because if Jesus is Black, then he's got a lot of explaining to do. Okay. So that's not the question, whether he existed or not, but that's for another show. But we're talking about the fact that Black minds matter too. Black psychology matters too. And for all of those Black people who say, well, it doesn't matter what color he is, then I'm sorry, but you really missed that course on Human Psychology 101, because it does matter. That is what led to their notions of supremacy in the first place. The idea that there was a God who somehow created them differently. So if God made whites, then who made Blacks? And so this is what is overlooked, I think, is the iconography. Everywhere you go, Sam's, I don't care, name a big retail store. Wherever you go, you're going to see a white Jesus. And I tell people that, yes, Jesus is white. And they say, what? I say, yeah, because he's white in Walmart. Walmart is the largest retailer in the world. So it doesn't matter what the reality is, it's the perception. And so as long as this perception exists, I don't care what you do. When you're a child and you see that image of Jesus, it's going to train your psychology to believe that whites are superior because the actual Son of God is superior. So I would like more discussion in this area of white iconography as we move forth with this movement.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeremiah. We're going to move next to Dr. Seville.
Still muted, my bad. Mandisa, thank you so much for having me. I certainly concur with the comments that have been offered thus far. What I'd like to add is actually to take a step back and to think about the first point of contact between people of African descent and people of European descent, particularly as it pertains to the religious cultures that they bring with them to this first this first meeting of contact and non-reciprocal exchange that occurs as a result of that encounter. One of the things that becomes established in American society is that religious systems are formed with the understanding of having a theocentric or God center. And I think that that's one of the things that is overlooked in the conversation about the role of white supremacy in America. And so what do I mean by that? Well, African descended people brought with them to the New World, right, a host and a variety of religious perspectives, religious thoughts, theological ways and systems of thinking that were not necessarily theocentric or God-centered. And so I think to define religion, right, as an enterprise, as a human enterprise that is centered around a deity and whose ultimate aim is to render worship, praise, right living, ethical living in response to this deity is one of the overlooked fundamental roots of the racist ideology that begins to permeate American Christianity. I think tied to that idea, right? So similar to the point that was just made, when you establish the idea of a supreme being, right, the corollary idea is that there must also be supreme human beings, right? That there is a hierarchy of relationships that is established between the divine and humanity. And so in turn, human beings try to replicate and reproduce those same hierarchies in their own societies. One of the major issues, I think, as it pertains to Christianity is that when this first period of contact and non-reciprocal exchange takes place between European missionaries and the Africans that they would colonize or enslave, is this idea of exclusivity, right? That right standing in social society was reserved exclusively for those who adhered to the faith parameters and directives of the Christian church. That there was no room for debate, that there was no room to take into the accounts, the perspectives, the experiences of people whose religious identities were not formed within Christian communities. Because this became the baseline understanding for understanding religion and spirituality in America, when it came to understanding what constituted ethical, moral behavior, right, these other perspectives that did not derive from Christian teachings were simply left out. And so I think that excluded a host of ideas, a host of theological ideas, spiritual orientations that could have countered, right, this narrative that white Christian ideology continued to put forth from its inception in American society. So I think one of the fundamental things that's missing from the conversation is how we fundamentally and basically define religion. What is a religion? And how do we then think about defining religion in ways that expand its definition and expand its boundaries so that people who are of no particular faith, so that people who are not theocentrically oriented can also bring to bear their perspectives and to shed light on ethical behavior as we move forward. So I would start by saying, how do we define religion? And understanding that the definition for what constitutes religion has a theological bias, right? It's fundamentally oriented and rooted to privileged forms of white Christianity. And I think until we can change the basic definition of what constitutes religion and religious thinking in American society, will continue to run into that obstacle.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Seville. We are going to end this question with Dr. Hutchinson.
Hey, good afternoon, and thanks so much for having me, Mandisa. What I want to underscore is the intersection of rape, misogyny, which is anti-Black misogyny, white supremacy, and capitalism, and the ways in which these structures inform and continue to inform the demonization of African-American femininity, explicitly in terms of the ways in which these regimes were buttressed by white Christian religious supremacy and its doctrines. And we can look at that in terms of all of the laws that were shaped in the 17th and 18th century vis-a-vis white Christian supremacy, and the degree to which Black women were constructed as the hypersexual, unrapeable, breeder Jezebel heathens whose productive and reproductive labor was the linchpin for the capitalist slave economy. And so in the 17th and 18th centuries, in Virginia, for example, in 1630, there was a law that explicitly forbade, quote unquote, white Christians, because in that era, Christian identity was synonymous with white identity and white humanity. White Christians were forbidden from fornicating with African others. And in her book, When and Where I Enter, Paula Giddings talks about how this particular law was instituted explicitly against the relationship. We don't know whether or not it was coercive or consensual, the relationship between a Black woman and a white man. And the white man was castigated for fornicating with a debased, amoral heathen. In 1662, there was a law that was instituted in Virginia that explicitly identified the status of children as flowing from the status of their mothers, which meant that enslaved African women could only produce slaves. And so you have the instrumentality of Black femininity to furthering, to buttressing, to reinforcing the capitalist slave economy, informed by white Christian dogma and white Christian political doctrine. The other example that I want to bring to mind with regard to 17th and 18th century colonial law and its implications in white Christian supremacy is this dynamic whereby increasingly to provide rights and privileges to white women, we see in 1705 a law that is instituted forbidding planters to, quote unquote, put white women servants, white women indentured servants into the ground working alongside of Black women. And that's the phrase that they used in that period, working in the ground, so that it was permissible to utilize Black women's labor, working in the ground, being the debased other, laboring for the plantation economy, whereby it was not permissible to do so for white women because white femininity was increasingly becoming this commodity for the exercise of European civilization, for nationhood, for femininity, for purity, for piety, and for innocence. And these were all qualities that were the antithesis, according to the ideology, doctrine, and propaganda of the period, the antithesis of Black femininity. And so this moral line in the sand is established by dint of white Christian supremacy and dominionism. Another thing that I want to point out in closing is the instrumentality of the publication a year after this law about the status of offspring of slaves, the publication of the seminal political tract by Cotton Mather, who was a Puritan pastor, called The Negro Christianized, which really establishes a template for the moral justification through the white Christian lens of slavery, of debasement, and of dehumanization. And basically giving a message to slaves that you should be satisfied with your docile status in the here and now, working the fields for the white slave master, being debased, demeaned, and dehumanized by the white slave master. This should be a form of penance for you, because you can reap an eternal reward in heaven in the afterlife. And so what Christian Mather said was that Slaves are the Lord's freemen in the afterlife. And so, to wrap up in terms of highlighting what needs to be foregrounded, all of these dogmas and these ideologies inform the ways in which African American women contemporarily continue to be viewed as the debased, hypersexual, amoral, unrapeable other, not having the same rights under the law, not being protected by due process, being overrepresented in prisons and juvenile facilities, having some of the highest rates of sexual violence and sexual abuse and sex trafficking in the nation, and continuing to be criminalized and policed as the moral, illicit, debased other.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Sikivu. We are now going to move on to our next question. And that which is, how has white supremacy and its Christian roots affected the legacy of the Black community, especially when it comes to resistance and the role of the non-religious people in monumental change? And we're going to start with Jeremiah on this one.
Okay, Mandy, so I'm going to try to just keep it short and sweet here. First of all, religion has taught the Black community that it's a false reality, because it's taught us that prayer, that belief, and that faith and worship are viable means to bringing about solutions. But we see that just is not the case. We can look around empirically and see that Black folks are the most praising people on earth, but yet we're on the bottom of every single category. The church has created a welfare mentality. The other day I was in a store somewhere, and I heard a lady tell another lady, who was having problems. She was saying, don't worry about it, God gonna take care of it. And to me, that's the same as saying, look.
Uh-oh, it looks like we lost Jeremiah. We are going to move to Dr. Butler until Jeremiah gets back.
Yeah, I can go ahead and start. I think one of the ways that this has affected the Black community, especially in terms of working for civil rights, it's been able to divide. And the reason why I say that is what has happened, if you think about this historically, to the traditional civil rights movement, you have King and other religious leaders being lifted up. Other people who were not as religious get squished into the background, essentially. I can think of a classic case between the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission. The SNCC wanted to do other kinds of things. They did not want to listen to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They had a big blow up about this, right? And this is a history that continues to repeat itself. If we even look at Black Lives Matter right now, one of the things I was struck by when Ferguson happened was when Jesse Jackson showed up, and I believe it was he was the one that got booed. And I thought, well, this is the change, right? Because basically what was happening was that people were saying, we're not going to do this in this way anymore. We need to be thinking about how do we make change without this kind of a religious structure. And so what I think is really important to see is that white supremacy has affected this in a lot of different ways. When you've had alliances between white supremacists and the Black church, and pastors being paid off or being told to tell your people to be quiet, ostensibly to keep their lives intact, but also not to rock the boat, right? In other words, what you have happening is that you get a sense of quietude. You get a sense that pastors are there to keep people quiet and not to revolt, especially in times when they've needed to revolt. And this happened, slavery, freedom, whole way through. So I think that it's time that we start to try to reframe this kind of conversation and to begin to think of not just the role of non-religious people in making changes for African Americans here in this country, but to also think about the way in which religion, and especially this form of Christianity that is rooted in white supremacy, has been able to sort of tamp down the expectations of the African American community in the search for justice and freedom in this country.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Butler. We're going to move to Sikivu for the next to respond?
Yeah, I would echo what Dr. Butler just said and amplify the very rich and robust tradition of Black secular humanist free thought resistance to mainstream religiosity in the African American community. So, for example, going back to the slave era, where we have Frederick Douglass very ardently as a forerunning abolitionist challenging religious orthodoxy in his towering oratory, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, where he demolishes the complicity of white religious institutions in the slave trade and in the dehumanization of Black bodies and the theft of Black labor. We can look at the ways in which he was censured by African American pastors post-emancipation, when these pastors were calling upon him to, quote unquote, thank God for emancipation. And he invoked his famous quote, "I bow to no priest, neither of faith or unfaith." And so that really becomes a template for Black critical resistance to religious orthodoxy. If we look at the early 20th century, in the communist and socialist movements, you have towering figures like Hubert Harrison and A. Philip Randolph, who were constantly critiquing and deconstructing religious orthodoxy and really looking at it from an anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist lens, as well as a class lens, and saying that the Black church has been one of the most insidious institutions when it comes to undermining the political will, resistance, and move to enfranchise African American working class and poor communities. This is a recurring theme in the critical resistance and social thought of African American secularists. I also want to underscore that Black women freethinkers are also coming into this narrative and not just critiquing imperialism, colonialism, and classism, but they're also looking at the ways in which the Black church specifically is imposing respectability upon Black women's agency and Black women's bodies. And this is particularly brought out in the landmark novel published in 1927 by Nella Larson called Quicksand, which is the first to portray an African American woman protagonist. And in Quicksand, just to briefly encapsulate, Nella Larson is quite frontal in her critique of Black religious orthodoxy and moral respectability and the toll that it has on Black women's selfhood and agency. Similarly, we have folks like Alice Walker during the second wave women's movement, making this frontal challenge to the connection between the domestication of Black women, the subjugation of Black women, and the erasure of Black women in the traditional Black church. She points to her mother as being terminally shut out of the leadership of their local church, and really underscores how, true to that old cliche, Black women were the backbone of the rise of the Black church as a seminal figure, as a seminal force within African American community movements. And so I think it's important to really highlight that Black religious orthodoxy has always been critiqued, but from a more left progressive lens, a humanist lens, among seminal African American political, historical, and movement figures who are not typically perceived as being espousing secular humanist belief systems.
Thank you, Sikivu. And last but not least, Dr. Seville.
Did it again. I'm still muted. Thank you for the question. So this question is particularly interesting. From earlier this week in the course that I'm teaching during the summer session at Georgetown, the students and I examined some of the primary source documents that the university has archived that tell the story of slavery at Georgetown. One of the documents was a journal entry that was written by a priest. And this was a part of the collection in which priests at Georgetown and other Jesuit leaders were contemplating exiting the business of slave owning, but they were still maintaining a pro-slavery attitude. So essentially, they decided that slavery was morally and theologically acceptable, but it just wasn't a business that the Jesuits themselves should be involved in. So they didn't want to be slave owners, but they didn't want to go the extra step of taking or adopting an abolitionist position. One of the major concerns that was debated as the priests were deciding what to do with the people that they owned was the spiritual well-being of the enslaved, right? I think one of the entries asks the question, well, what would become of the souls of the enslaved if they were sold to non-Catholic or non-Christian masters, right? And so I think that in that question, Christianity or white Christian theology's ability to separate, to create a false dichotomy between the material world and the world of the spirit, right? I think that's fundamentally important and fundamentally critical to a part of the negative impact of the legacy on African American communities, particularly as it pertains to resistance, right? Because advocating for temporal political resistance has no value, right, in the spiritual economy that's been devised by white American Christianity. Temporal liberation, temporal blessings, right? Our success in the material world is ultimately of secondary or no concern. So this false dichotomy that separates spirit from body, that separates the spirit world from the material world, which is foreign to the thought, right, of traditional African religious conceptions, foreign to the thought of traditional African beliefs. I think that in turn is a particular impediment to African American resistance movements. This version of Christianity also makes docility and passivity a virtue, right? So the image or the idea of a Christian savior who is not concerned about upsetting the status quo, who is more concerned about ensuring his own personal survival or ensuring the personal survival of individual believers, right? This necessarily separates them or distances them from the everyday concerns of the material world because it continues to emphasize this otherworldly focus, right? So I think that this false dichotomy of separating these things has certainly been fundamental to a negative impact in terms of the resistance and resistance movements within Black communities.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seville. And our final question, which I'm going to ask that our panelists keep their comments very brief because we want to make sure we get any questions from the audience. We are seeing the calls for removals and also removals of monuments and statues that commemorate racism and oppression. One example is at the University of Pennsylvania and George Whitefield, who was a pro-slavery evangelical leader in the 1800s. Is this a good start for dismantling structural racism? And what should be the next steps for us? Now I'm going to start with Jeremiah since we lost you earlier. We're going to start with you, sir.
All right, I'm on my phone. I was on my laptop, but I hope you can see me okay and hear me okay.
Yes, you're good.
Okay, all right. I mean, that's a good start, Mandisa. You know, you're dismantling some of the monuments. You know, Trump, he said, no, you're not going to dismantle Jesus. You know, like I was saying earlier, take down the billboards. Listen, why? First of all, it should be illegal to have movies like The Son of God, The Passion of the Christ. Let's take down the movies that project whites as the only people in the universe that have this godly association. You know, even on Netflix, you have this thing, John and Peter and Paul and all of this type of stuff. Again, we have to think about the imagery because a lot of the people that are watching this right now, many of the people, they're not really students of it. They don't study what produced the Bible. They read and study the Bible itself. But if you're a student of the Bible and you know what has transpired throughout the years with the imagery that is related to this Bible, you know that it's detrimental psychologically speaking. So while we're starting with this monument, then let's move on to the movies. Let's move on to just about anywhere you go. You come Christmas time, you're going to have these white nativity scenes. There'll always be that little black man over in the corner. I guess he was one of the wise men. I don't know. But here in the city of Atlanta, one of the largest black churches that we have here in this city has a white nativity scene. And here it is, baby Jesus is Snow White. What does this do to the psychology of black people? It's just like you had gold that once backed the dollar and gave the dollar its value. Well, the belief that God is white is what backed white people and gave them their value, to the extent where we can have gentrification going on and nobody wants to talk about it. When whites move in, all of a sudden the neighborhood is now of more value. That's because they had something backing them. And what backed them was the notion that there is this God that created them to be more superior. We have to start talking about the notions of superiority and inferiority. Because if one group is superior, then you're going to have the other group is going to be inferior. So these notions exist. So I would applaud them, taking down that monument. But we have a lot more to go. And that's why I'm in, at the goal line, so to speak, of this nonprofit group that I'm starting. It's called ERICA, Ending Religious Iconography in America. Because if we don't do that, like I have a grandchild, one on the way. I don't want them going to the doctor's office and seeing that Bible book that we're all familiar with Adam White, with Eve White, with all of this stuff. This affects you psychologically. I still have that image of that white Jesus in my mind that was ingrained in it when I was 5 and 6 years old. That's not going anywhere. You can't erase that from the jury. They've already heard it. They've already seen it. So it's there. I want to make the movies illegal. Son of God, the white boy, I forget the movie he was in, Heaven is for Real or something. He described Jesus as having blonde hair and blue eyes. See, this is the kind of craziness that we're all, being subjected to. And as a black person, as a non-white person, it's offensive. So if black lives really matter, black minds should matter as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeremiah. We're going to go to Sikivu next.
My quick and dirty answer is that for me, removing monuments is hollow window dressing unless it is associated with disruptive structural change. So let's look at the brutal stats. African Americans have far less wealth than do whites. Whites have 20 to 30 times the wealth as African Americans. Black women have a whopping penny to the dollar of white families. Only 14% of African American millennials own homes in the 21st century. And so if we look at Black home ownership as a litmus test for multi-generational wealth building, Black home ownership is at record low levels, hearkening back to the Brown v. Board era. And so we cannot move if disproportionate numbers of African Americans are homeless, if disproportionate numbers of African Americans cannot afford rent, if disproportionate numbers of queer and trans and non-binary African American youth are being kicked out of their homes, partly due to religious discrimination, transphobia, homophobia, and trans antagonism. If disproportionate numbers of African Americans continue to be shackled in prisons where they are disproportionately contracting and dying from COVID, then to me, toppling structures, removing toxic, insidious, white supremacist statues is the ultimate, again, window dressing. And so there needs to be a systematic program of reparations. What has been suggested in certain sectors, high interest investment accounts, defunding and ultimately abolishing oppressive law enforcement structures, the police, the sheriffs, other criminal justice structures like cash bail that disproportionately impact and oppress African American mobility. We need to look at generating real multi-generational wealth. That will ultimately, in addition to some of the other remedies that were suggested by Jeremiah in terms of critical consciousness and decolonizing the minds of African American folks, as well as European Americans and non-Blacks. Those are some of the mechanisms that will go towards truly redressing systematic white supremacy, oppression, and colonialism.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hutchinson. We're going to move on to Dr. Seville.
Yeah, so speaking as a person who at least who grew up in a faith community, I want to say that I do recognize the importance of symbols, and I do recognize the importance of the repetition of, or the representation of symbols in public space. So do I think that the removal and the removal of symbols, the renaming of buildings on college camps, do I think that that's significant? Yes, I do think that that's significant, but I don't think that that ultimately accomplishes the goal, the end goal of creating a just society or rendering our societies more equitable. So I do think it's important to rename, right? Because I think naming is tremendously important and intimately connected to revealing orientation. And so I think that even if the change of a name or the removal of a statue doesn't necessarily suggest that a new orientation has emerged in its place immediately, I do think that it's certainly a significant place to start. And I do think that also when we create, if we're able to finally create a just society, one of the things that we do is that we do rename spaces in ways that represent the diverse experiences of American history that sort of work together to create the society that we inhabit. One of the challenges that I think we face, that African Americans have had to wrestle with and have had to grapple with in the long history, in the long struggle towards equality and freedom, is holding in tension, right? This notion of change over time, but then while also still acknowledging and recognizing the repetition of symbols and structures of racism and oppression, right? So certainly we can look at phenomena such as, the era of mass incarceration. We can look at phenomena like redlining, like Dr. Sikivu pointed out, right? This litany of structural impediments to Black people's success. And we can see in these the repetitions of structures and symbols that were certainly rooted in slavery and have changed and modified and morphed into these new forms of oppression over time. And we hold that in tension, but I think it's important for us to also recognize that we do not live in the same day that we lived in the past, that there has been change over time. Now, has that change been adequate, or has that change, does that change move us to the end goal of a just society, or to an end goal of a more equitable society? I don't think it does, but I do think it's important to acknowledge even small victories, even as we say these victories are not enough, but they are certainly significant. So I don't want to undermine the importance of the work that has been done, because I'm personally connected to people who have done the critical work of organizing to have these types of statues and monuments removed, particularly in my home city of Memphis, Tennessee. Many of the chief organizers of the Take 'Em Down 901 campaign and were folks that I respect tremendously. And I just want to be able to acknowledge the work that went into creating those types of forms of change. So again, do I think that the removal of statues or the renaming of spaces in and of itself accomplishes the ultimate goal of justice? Absolutely not. But I do think it's important to acknowledge those victories, to celebrate those small victories, and also to reflect on the value of them. We can't reflect on the value of those victories if we never win them. And they don't become meaningful if we don't have that moment of reflection. So I don't want to be dismissive of them, and I'm not suggesting that anybody is saying that we have been, but I do just want to highlight the importance and the value of symbolic changes like the removal of statues and the renaming of spaces.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Seville. And the final word on this will go to Dr. Butler.
Let me just put it very bluntly. Take them all down. That's it. Take them all down. Because, I appreciate both sides of this argument, but let me put this another way because I think this is really important. One of the things about America is that it is spatially delineated. In other words, what these statues did was to let you know and remind you over and over and over again that these Confederates who lost were still mighty men. They were still great. They still had it going on. And so to watch these statues come down is a symbol, and not just a symbol, but a real sense in which people can start to see this old history, this history that we've been told is not the truth. There's another history here that we need to learn. And so I think this serves a couple of purposes. One purpose is to remove these geographical markers that delineate space. These are spaces in which Black people were not allowed to be in. You don't get to go to the center of the square and go throw some paint on the Confederate monument because you knew back then that would get you killed. Now to take that down says something else. It means this space is for everyone. It's not just for the people who actually were traitors to the country. So that's number one. Number two is I think it dismantles structural racism because we have practices in this country that still continue things about the Civil War. You have reenactors. You have people who wave the rebel flag. You've got all these things that are going on, and that is a symbol of white supremacy in and of itself. And so to be able to begin to see these things go away is beginning to see change. It doesn't mean that that's the only thing, but we can't just, do window dressing. We need to break some windows. This is the way I'd like to call it. If you're going to take down the structure, take it down piece by piece. Let me say last thing really quickly. One of the things in this country that I think a lot of people don't even think about in terms of monuments are plantations. Plantations are tourism here in this country. They could either be educational tourism or they could be wedding tourism. And lots of white people get married at plantations and think nothing of it. But that is just a recapitulation of hoping that, oh, gee, look at this wonderful time. I could get married on a plantation. Isn't this romantic? No, it's not romantic. That's where my ancestors were raped, beaten, killed, working from sunup to sundown. And so if we start to take down these statues, monuments, structures, we begin to change the physical space of this country, and we begin to change that space where there's a space for our history to be known, not just white people's history.
Yes, thank you all so much for being a part of this discussion. I know we ran a bit long for the panel discussion, so we're just going to end the first session here. Thank you all for being a part of this. This was a very wonderful and informative segment. This concludes the first part of it. Thank you to the Stiefel Free Thought Foundation for sponsoring this event. And most important, thank you all for watching. So you can follow and subscribe to be in on social media. On Facebook, we're at Black Nonbelievers. Instagram, we're at Be Nonbelievers Inc. At Twitter, at Be Nonbelievers. The B and the N are capitalized. At YouTube, at Black Nonbelievers Inc. Please support the work of Black Nonbelievers by making a tax-deductible donation. Do visit our website for more information on how to do that. You may also donate to us through Cash App at Black Nonbelievers and selecting us as a beneficiary on Amazon Smile. Please don't go anywhere. We're going to take a short break and we will be right back. Thank you.